Hello! Welcome back to the channel. It's been a minute since we last spoke. I've been a bit preoccupied, but no matter, because today we are right back at it. If you can't tell by these mountains, we are in familiar territory. Morongo Casino, once again, because it turns out today, Morongo is having their first ever 25-50 no limit game. A friend of mine put it together and invited me, so here I am to play some semi-high stakes. It's very high for Morongo. I think there's actually a cap on the buy-in, $10,000 max, which is totally fine by me. It's a fun group of guys, so there should be plenty of action nevertheless. This is definitely something I miss, by the way. Poker rooms don't have this kind of view near LA. Definitely more my scene. But enough of that. The game is not outdoors, it is indoors. So let's head inside and jump straight into some 25-50 action. Good luck to us. Alrighty guys, we are back once more to go over some hands. Today the game is 25-50 here at Morongo. I am in for $10,000. Let's waste no more time before jumping into the first interesting one. In this hand we are playing a $100 bomb pot, meaning every player puts in $100 pre-flop and we all get dealt in and go straight to a flop. I look down at King Queen in the big blind, a good starting hand typically, but when you're playing a bomb pot against every single player, you're really just trying to connect with the board. Flop comes down ace 10-3 with two hearts, and all things considered, this is not a bad flop at all. We have the king of hearts, meaning we could represent a flush if it comes in later, and of course we have a straight draw if a jack were to come. So with that in mind, when the small blind checks, I decide to start bluffing. Now, one advantage to bomb pots is that people are usually pretty tight because, you know, they're afraid that someone else has got a monster. So I think bluffing is a little underrated in these situations. That said, I put out $300, not expecting to get it through right away, but just trying to see what develops later on. Two players make the call, which sounds about right. I'm looking for a good turn card to continue bluffing, and that's exactly what we get. It's the 8 of hearts, meaning we now have the nut flush draw. And like I said, on the flop, we could represent a flush if need be, and I think at this point that is a good idea, so I decide to try to represent it. I throw in $1,200 this time, and luckily we get a fold from both players, so not a ton of action in this first bomb pot, but nice to start the day off with a win. In the next one, I raise in late position with pocket sevens to $150 and get called by both the small and big blind. So we're going to go three ways in position to a delicious flop of Jack 7-3 rainbow. That, ladies and gentlemen, is middle set. Great hand, so when it checks to me, I bet $150 again. The small blind makes the call, but the big blind folds. Turn card is not great. It's the ace of spades. So if the small blind called on the flop with a jack, this might be a scare card, which will prevent us from getting more action, but I'm not trying to focus on that too much. Instead, I am thinking of how I would play all my hands. So after he checks, I decide to overbet the pot. If I had any sort of bluff or semi-bluff, this is what I'd do as well. So with strong hands, I believe it makes sense to do the same thing. I throw in a bet of 150% the size of the pot, $1,100, and I'm happy to see that my opponent does not snap fold. In fact, he takes a few seconds before making the call. So we've got some action here, looking for a clean river card to try to get some more value. And what do you know? It is the cleanest of river cards, 7 of diamonds. A bit overkill, you might say, but a welcome sight nonetheless. We've got 4 of a kind, not something you can say every day. And of course, there's more action to be had. Small blind checks, and now it's back to me for the last time. And I think, again, like I said on the turn, an overbet makes the most sense. We are either representing a very strong hand or nothing at all after betting large on the turn. So I'm going to go for it. 150% the size of the pot once more. This time it's $4,400 if my math is correct. And again, my opponent does not snap fold, so looking good so far. And what do you know, after a few seconds, he actually decides to call. That's going to be good news because we have the best possible hand. So I turn it over, and sure enough, we're taking down this over $10,000 pot. Pretty big one for a game this size. So far, so great. Next, there's an early position open to 150. Player on his left calls, and I defend the big blind with King Jack offsuit. We go to a flop of Ace Queen 6 with 2 diamonds. We don't have the King of Diamonds, but instead the Jack of Diamonds. All things considered, though, it's still not the worst flop ever, as we have a straight draw to the nuts. I check, early position, C-bets, $225. Player behind him folds, and already, even though we do have a straight draw, I think folding is probably fine. But this is a player that I want to give some action to, and who knows, maybe we hit a 10, right? So I make the call out of position, not necessarily recommended, but it is when you're going to turn the nuts like I did here. 10 of clubs right away, offsuit 10, not even a flush to worry about. I check it again, expecting him to continue betting, and we could try to build this pot through a check raise, but my opponent is too wise and ends up checking it back. So we go to a river, which is not the best. It's the 8 of diamonds, bringing in the front door flush. I decide to go for some value now, but don't want to bet too big considering this board texture, so I put in a bet of around half pot, $500 with 1 purple chip. My opponent is none too pleased, but he also doesn't fold right away. He goes back and forth for about a minute or two before finally deciding to call. So once again, we are getting value with a strong hand. No complaints so far in the session. In the next fun hand, we are once again playing a $100 bomb pot. So everyone has thrown in $100, and I look down at Jack 10 offsuit in middle position. Flop comes down King 7-6, so not much going on for me. When it checks to me, I also check it, as does everyone else. So we are going to get a free turn card, which is the 9 of clubs. If you look closely, that is a double gutter, as the kids call it, meaning we have 2 ways to a straight, but it's not an open-ender. It's a little bit confusing, but all you need to know is that an 8 or a queen would give me a straight. That looks good enough to me. So when early position leads out for $350 and it gets back around to me, I decide to come along for the ride, toss in the call. Maybe we could hit one of those dream cards, and of course being in position is much better than out of position like last hand. So I toss in the 350 and everyone else folds. So we're gonna go heads up to this river, which once again is a miracle. The 8 of hearts. Offsuit 8, giving us the stone cold nuts. Not only that, but any 5 or 10 makes a straight now. That would be no good though, as I've got the Jack high straight. Hopefully my opponent has a 10, although it doesn't seem too likely after he leads out on the turn. Not a lot of hands that contain a 10 that I think would play that way. Anyway, he now checks it over to me, which I think confirms suspicions that he probably doesn't have a straight. But what am I going to do, right? I've got the nuts. Time to bet and hope to get called once again. Easy game when that's the case. I throw in $1,050, and similar to last hand and even the hand before that, he doesn't call right away, but he does not fold right away. But in the end, it seems players here at Morongo are the curious type, because he says he wants to see what I've got, throws in the call. That's bad news for him, and we are going to be taking down another pot. This one, $3,700. We're 4 for 4. Don't worry, this isn't how poker normally is. Things will probably even out at some point soon. At this point, we enter a stretch where I get nothing playable until the very next bomb pot, which I believe they were every 45 minutes or so. So I didn't play a hand for 45 minutes, and that brings us to the next bomb pot. In this one, I've got Ace 3 of diamonds in middle position. We go to a flop of Ace 8-7 with 1 diamond, giving us a weak top pair, but a top pair nonetheless, and a backdoor flush draw. Middle position bets $200. I make the call, and one other player makes the call as well. We go to a turn, which is an interesting one. It's the Ace of Hearts. That means we've got 3 of a kind. It's getting a little bit embarrassing how often we're hitting today. First player checks, and now it's back to the guy who bet the flop, and he continues. $500 this time. Perhaps a little bit concerning because he bet the flop, got called in 2 spots, and is still betting on this turn card. So even though I have a super strong hand, I'm not necessarily in love with the situation. I make the call, and the other guy folds. Going to a river, which doesn't bring me any help. It's the 4 of hearts. That does complete 6-5, which is an open-ender on the flop, but shouldn't change anything much aside from that. And it seems that the middle position player, who has been the aggressor this whole hand, is also none too concerned with this card because he fires out again. $1,500. Not the best situation ever. I mean, of course, I've got 3 of a kind. What's there to say, right? But at the same time, even though our hand does seem awesome, it is just a bluff catcher, in my opinion, because I don't see a worse hand that he would be value betting in this spot. So I think we're just beating bluffs. He could easily have a better ace. He could have a full house. He could have, pocket eights, pocket sevens. He could also have a hand like 6-5 of clubs. Granted, he could also have some flush draws like, Jack 10 of clubs that just decide to go for it. But I've played with this guy a fair amount, and I've never really seen him try to bluff all 3 streets. In fact, I think I've seen it exactly 0 times. So after thinking about it for some time, I decided to make what I consider hero fold. Maybe to some of you this seems like a normal fold, but to me this is a really tight fold. Not something I do too often, but I do decide to let it go. And my opponent shows me pocket eights. I'm just kidding. He didn't show me anything, so I probably got bluffed, but just let me sleep at night. All right. In the next one, I straddle to $100 and we get dealt pocket tens. Early position limps in for 100. Late position raises to 300. The button calls the 300 and then it's on me. Considering that the raise came from late position and the button makes the call, even though I don't hate just flatting with my hand, I decide to put in the re-raise. I make it 1500. The early position limper folds, but the original raiser makes a call. Button also gets out of the way, so we're going to go heads up out of position to a flop of king 7-6 with 2 spades. Kind of mixed feelings about this one. We don't have an overpair anymore, but a king should be better for me generally. I'm going to be honest, I'm not 100% sure what the best play is in this situation. Not sure if it's betting big sometimes and checking sometimes, or if it's just a small bet every time. I don't really know, should probably check up on that, but I decided to just bet small, $1,150, and it turns out all that thought was for nothing because my opponent just lets it go. Kind of a nothing burger, but we do end up winning around $2,000 after he folds. Not too shabby. Next, middle position opens to 150. Guy on his left calls, and I am next to act with ace-10 offsuit. Not really the strongest hand, but I decide to get aggressive with it. Could make some strong hands, and we also have removal to a bunch of powerful holdings like ace-king, aces, pocket tens, ace-queen, etc. And I haven't been too out of line today, so I think this is a good situation being in position. I make it 600. The original raiser folds. That looks like good news. But then the guy who called his $150 open, he calls again. So that's pretty much best case scenario. Even more so when we go to a flop of 10-8-7 with 2 diamonds. So we've got top. At the same time, it's a better board for my opponent than it is for me. And maybe he knows that because he decides to lead out on this flop for $350. Now it's on me, and I don't really think a raise makes too much sense. Granted, he did bet really tiny, so I could get behind a raise sometimes, but with my exact hand, I think a call is fine. So that's what I do, and we see a 4 of clubs on the turn. Now my opponent continues, $950. Well, I've still got top, and I still don't really see a point in raising, so once more, I make the call. Not thrilled about this, but also we still beat a lot of bluffs and even worse hands that he might be value betting, like a weaker 10, for example. River is not the best, though. It's the 6 of clubs. So now any 9 makes a straight. There are more 2-pair combinations, and overall, it's just not the best card to see. My opponent continues betting, this time $1,600, and it's not a fun spot whatsoever. We're getting a pretty good price to call and are still beating some bluffs and some potential weaker 10s, although it's highly questionable if he would continue playing a 10 this way on the river. Most likely he might just check with a hand like queen 10 suited, for example. But at the same time, we are losing to all sorts of stuff now as well. So kind of a close one. I decide to take the conservative route this time for whatever reason and fold this one as well. Wouldn't hate a call, but I think a fold is probably better, so that's what I did. Once again, my opponent does not show, so we will never know. I'm sure the experts in the chat and the comment section will let me know whether that was right or wrong. In the next one, we are playing a round of stand-up. If you guys are not familiar, everyone stands up. You got to win a hand to earn your seat, aka sit back down. And if you are the last one standing, you pay everyone else a bounty. In this case, the bounty number was $100. And unfortunately, I am one of the last 2 remaining. So it is really down to the wire here. Early position opens to 150, and I look down in middle position at 10 deuce suited. A popular hand made famous by Doyle Brunson. So I am going to try to pay some homage to him and raise it up to 500 bucks. It gets around to a player in late position now who happens to be the other guy still standing, and he decides he's had enough and jams his entire stack in there, $2,500 total. Back around to early position, who was the original raiser. He's not interested. He gets out of the way, but I've got 10 high and a dream. I can't go anywhere just yet, so I make the call, hoping for the best, hoping that he doesn't have a pair, and at least we have live cards. I don't really want to fold for two reasons. One is I'm here to give action and have fun with some old friends. Second is that if I fold, I have to pay out $800 anyway. Doesn't seem like a great incentive. I'd rather call 2,500 and maybe win than pay out 800 bucks. That logic probably makes no sense, but life goes on. We decide to run it twice, and what do you know? We hit a 10 on the first run out, which is the one that counts for stand-up. We end up losing on the second board as my opponent ended up having pocket eights, but that does not matter because even though we chopped the pot, which in and of itself is running good in this situation, we avoid losing stand-up. So that means we earn our seat, the game ends, and we get our $100 bounty from this guy. Moving right along to the next one, middle position opens to 175, and I am next to act with ace queen suited, finally a great hand. So I make it $500. I should say a great starting hand. I've got plenty of great hands today. I make it 500. The button cold calls the 500, and then it gets back around to the original raiser who makes it $2,000. Probably a very strong hand like ace king or pocket kings, but that said, we do have position, a very playable hand, and more importantly, both of us are rather deep at this point. I think around $15,000 a piece. So I decide to make the call in hopes of winning a big pot later on. Button gets out of the way, and we go heads up to a flop of king 10-6 with one spade. Not ideal necessarily, but a jack would give us the straight and most likely the best hand, even if it was the jack of diamonds. And of course, we do have backdoor spades. So when my opponent continues for a small size of 1,200, I make the call, looking for some help. It does not come, however. It's the 9 of clubs. This time my opponent slows down and checks it, which to me seems like a very suspicious check. I don't want to take this bait, although I did consider it, or at least what I think is bait, because let's face it, this guy put in a bunch of money pre-flop. He's probably got aces, ace king, maybe even pocket kings, perhaps pocket queens that we could try to bluff off this board, but I've got a queen myself. How likely is that? So I decided to check it back. River is the 2 of clubs. This time he leads out for $3,000 and I just fold. And I'm glad I did not stab on the turn because he turns over pocket kings. So that would have been a disaster. Moving on to this next one where there's an early position open to 150 bucks. 2 players make the call and I am looking down at jack 8 offsuit in the big blind. Now I know what you're thinking. Why is this hand even in the vlog? And guys, I am wondering the same thing looking back. But in the moment, I got a weak vibe from everyone in this pot. The guy who opened to 150 was like talking and distracted the whole time. The 2 callers, well, let's be honest, they just called. How strong could their hands be? So I decided to pounce on this perceived weakness by making it $750. This is definitely one of those do as I say, not as I do situations, because even if everything I just said is true, jack 8 offsuit is just a terrible candidate to try to go on this adventure with. But here we are. I make it $750. The original raiser calls. The middle position player who called his open folds, but then the small blind, he calls again. So we're going to go 3 ways in an odd situation already to a flop of 10-7-3 rainbow. That's a straight draw for me and an overcard. And also, probably no one is too strong unless they flop a set. So I'm going to continue bluffing. Small blind checks. I put in $800, and both of these guys call. Probably time to give it up now, but the turn is the deuce of diamonds, which shouldn't really bring anyone much help. I would probably prefer to continue betting on a Broadway card, but for whatever reason, I was feeling very hopeful that this would work. So when the small blind checks again, I put in $2,400, hoping to get folds from middling pocket pairs. And even if one of these guys has a 10 and they call again, it's going to be really tough to hang on for a third bet on the river, I suspect. Of course, it does depend on what river card comes, but let's say it's like a king or another 3, something like that, and I decide to fire once again. I don't know, if I were in their shoes with a 10, I would not love it. So these are my thoughts as I continue bluffing for $2,400. And all that comes to a screeching halt when the player on my left raises the minimum to $5,000, well, a hair over the minimum, but essentially a min raise. Small blind folds right away. Now it's back on me, and I am here wondering, what the hell have I done? I just essentially burned a bunch of money. Of course, hindsight is 2020. This would have been a genius play in some other situations where both of these guys fold on the turn, but this is not one of those moments. In fact, it is the opposite, where I feel like an idiot instead of a genius and decide to just let it go instead of digging a deeper hole. Player on my left is a cool guy and decides to show me his hand after I fold, and he had King 10 offsuit. So definitely the best hand, an interesting raise, but it gets the job done, and that's actually one of those hands that I was trying to make fold, at least on the river, but we won't really get a chance because we end up folding. So with that disastrous, pathetic hand out of the way, we move to this one where we are once again playing a bomb pot. At this point, it's pretty late. The game is six-handed, so only $600 in the middle. I look down at Jack 8 of hearts in middle position, and we go to a flop of Jack 9-7 with 1 heart. Early position leads out for $250. And I think almost always just calling makes sense here. We have a straight draw, top pair, backdoor flush draw. It's a decent hand, and we've got showdown values, so don't really see much point in raising. However, I think occasionally raising makes some sense as a bluff because this is a bomb pot, and I think the player who leads out in early position is very unlikely to be betting a hand worse than Jack 8 on this flop. You got to remember, this is a bomb pot, so when people bet, it's usually a very strong holding. We do have an 8, which is removal to the nuts. 10-8 is the nuts, and we've got some backdoor possibilities. So I decided to get aggressive right away. I make it $800 to go. Once again, my plans are thwarted when the player on the button decides to raise it. He announces a raise, but makes it only $1,700, which again is pretty much a min raise, maybe just a touch over. Early position player folds. He's the one who led out on a flop, and now it's back to me. And we are both pretty deep, myself and the button. So I think calling at least once makes sense for such a small sizing. So I tossed in the call, and we get a nice turn card. It's the 4 of hearts, giving us a flush draw to go along with our top pair and straight draw. I check, and my opponent bets the perfect amount, unfortunately. Perhaps he saw my hand because he throws in $3,000, which is just the exact amount that you hate to see. It's not the best price to continue out of position, but we have so many outs, and he has $4,000 or $5,000 behind, which I suspect we could probably win on the river if a heart or a 10 were to come. So these are all thoughts going through my mind. At the same time, we're out of position, and it's $3,000. Don't really want to call either. I don't know. I think it's close, but in the end, I do decide to call. Feeling lucky, perhaps. Maybe this is just an easy call. I'm not really sure, but I do toss in the $3,000. Unfortunately, we see no help on the river. It's the 5 of clubs, so I check it. He jams all in, and I fold. Underwhelming end to that hand. And on top of that, we lost like $5,000 in that one, so not very fun. But that, ladies and gentlemen, brings us to the last hand of today's session, and this was definitely a doozy. We are four-handed at this point. It's around 2 a.m., and I am in the double straddle for $200. Folds around all the way to the $100 straddle, who calls the additional 100. So he limps into my double straddle, and I look down at 9-3 offsuit. This is a pathetic starting hand. Of course, let's just get that out of the way. But in my opinion, raising with trash hands after one of the blinds limps to you is not the worst strategy ever. There's many, many times where you can just c-bet on the flop and take it down. This is a very nuanced situation, though. Most games, you don't have the blinds limping into each other. Players usually chop or someone has raised beforehand. So yeah, don't take too much note of what I'm saying now. Also, I think it's worth noting that 9-3 offsuit is not really a hand that you want to raise with even after the blinds complete. But yeah, that's getting a little long-winded. I make it $800 for reasons I just explained. And my opponent makes the call. So we're going to have to play 9-3 offsuit, but we do have position. And, if we hit a good board, we can try to bluff. Flop comes down 8-6-3 with 2 hearts, and that's not exactly the flop I had in mind. We do make a pair, so can't complain much about that, but 8-6-3 with a flush draw is probably going to connect more with the guy who limped in and then called a raise than with the guy who raised pre-flop, which in this case is me. So when he checks, I check it back. Don't really want to face a check raise. And what do you know? We turn trips. It's the 3 of diamonds, giving me a very disguised 3 of a kind. Even better news is that my opponent now leads out for $1,000. Don't really think a raise makes much sense at this point, since he could be bluffing with straight draws or flush draws or just 2 overcards that, are trying to make me fold. And he could also just have better hands like pocket 8s or pocket 6s, maybe even a better 3 once in a while. So again, I don't think there's much merit to raising. I just make the call, and we see the best river card in the deck, or at least it looks pretty good to me. It's the 9 of hearts, bringing in the flush draw, bringing in some straight draws, and of course giving me a full house. I'm happy to see my opponent does not hate this card either, because he throws in a bet of $2,000. At this point, I take a look at his stack and he's got like 8K behind. So it would be a pretty big raise, but nothing too crazy. So when it's back to me, I think an all-in makes the most sense. It is a little bit of a large raise, but I don't want to make it like 6,000. That might even look stronger to my opponent. So I give it some thought and eventually announce all in. Fingers crossed that we don't get snap called by pocket 8s or pocket 6s, but if that happens, well, that's just how poker goes sometimes. Can't be afraid of monsters under the bed. Luckily, we don't get snap called this time, which seems like good news to me. But even better news is that eventually he does call. I announce the full house, and my opponent is not too happy as he turns over the 10-7 of hearts. An absolute cooler river card, as it gives my opponent a straight and a flush, but not a straight flush. So that means full house is going to win this one. And that is how we ended the night, winning this nearly $20,000 pot. Not a bad ending whatsoever, and definitely helps the Jack 8 offsuit debacle from earlier. Anyway, that was the last fun one of the night. As always, I hope you all enjoyed the hands. All right, it is currently the next day from the session you guys just saw. I had to get some sleep, and yes, I'm wearing the same shirt. Don't judge me. All right, I forgot to pack an extra shirt. Don't act like you've never done it. Anyway, last night the game went until like 2 a.m. so I wanted to get some sleep before coming back and debriefing with you guys. This is actually a Morongo hotel room. I've never stayed at the Morongo hotel. They hooked me up with one of these for vlogging last night, and I gotta say it's not bad at all. It's also got this awesome view. Right, no complaints whatsoever about staying here tonight. Got some good sleep, 7 or 8 hours or so. So that means I'm ready to chat with you guys about the session from last night. Overall, first and foremost, I had a blast. The group that I played with was the typical Morongo crew, really fun home game type of vibe. The action was nonstop, a lot of all-ins. The $10,000 max buy-in actually generated more action in a weird way, because no one was like super deep to start the game, so people were just going nuts. Sadly, I did not end up winning a whole lot of money, but that's okay, what can you do? I was in the game for around like 15,000 or so and cashed out for 17 and change. So ended up winning like 2K. Not a bad night whatsoever, but in a game with that much action, you can sometimes hope for a little more, maybe next time. By the way, the chip shot that you guys saw at the very end where I had like a bunch of money in my stack, that's all the additional chips I had also bought in case things went wrong. Luckily, I didn't end up using most of them, but I just realized that I stacked them all together and filmed that shot, so it makes it seem like I won a bunch. I did not. But yeah, that brings an end to today's video. I know some of you guys, especially the longtime subscribers, have always been fans of the Morongo vlogs, since it's kind of like the roots of this channel, if you will. So for all you guys out there who are OG subscribers and enjoy the Morongo videos, this one was for you. If you guys are new, perhaps, then this is a fun casino that I come to once in a while, and the action is great, just the stakes are a little bit smaller than normal. That being said, we're going back to the high stakes programming this upcoming week. I am playing on Hustler on Wednesday, I believe, and hopefully more often after that. So yeah, if this video comes out on Tuesday, I'll be playing the following day, Wednesday. Tune in and see whether or not I lose a bunch of money or win a bunch of money. What else is new? As always, thank you guys for the support. Until next time, good luck at your local tables. Peace.